Thank you. I'm here to speak on the upcoming Methane Congressional Review Act matter and to speak in support of overturning the Trump misrule regarding the problem of methane emissions. Let's just start by setting the stage that about a quarter of the global warming that we've experienced has been due to methane, and about a third of that is due to the activities of the oil and gas industry. So this is a very significant part of our climate problem. I should say our climate and oceans problem. And we don't actually know how bad it is. The Environmental Defense Fund has recently estimated that methane emissions from oil and natural gas operations could be as much as 60% higher than previous estimates. So it's a significant part of the problem. One of the reasons we don't know how bad the problem is because of the way the oil and gas industry has behaved about reporting its methane problem. Now, just to understand, what the natural gas industry would like to tell you is that natural gas is a far cleaner fuel, far safer from a climate perspective than coal or than oil, bunker oil, or whatever else you want to burn. And it is true that once natural gas has been burned at the burner tip, it is less harmful. What the natural gas industry wants you to forget is everything between the well and the burner tip. Because through that enormous web of piping occurs so much leakage that satellites flying overhead can pick up the pools of methane floating in our atmosphere from the leakage. The natural gas industry doesn't want to talk about that, and one of the things that they did was they got the Trump administration to, early on, withdraw EPA's request that in the previous administration the industry had more or less agreed to, that would have required oil and gas companies to report on their methane emissions. When the fossil fuel apparatchiks occupied in the Trump administration the offices at EPA and Energy and Interior and other places important to the industry, they did what the industry wanted. And the very first thing, March 2nd, 2017, was to withdraw the request that would have had oil and gas companies report how bad their methane leakage actually was. Didn't take long to follow that up on March 28 with an executive order from Trump directing EPA to suspend or rescind existing methane regulations for the oil and gas industry. But that wasn't enough for the oil and gas industry. On April 19th, they got EPA to postpone implementation of a rule that would have required them to equip new wells with equipment to prevent methane leaks. You wouldn't think that would be asking too much, particularly from an industry that wants to tell everybody that it's better for the climate and the environment than the rest of the fossil fuel industry. But no, they asked EPA to undo that requirement so they could more readily leak methane from new wells. And even that wasn't enough. In May of 2017, they got the Department of the Interior to suspend a rule that would have required oil and gas companies to curb the flaring of methane from their oil and gas wells on public lands. And then again, September 11th, 2018, they got EPA to propose a rule to weaken the methane leak detection and repair requirements for their new wells, weaken the detection and repair requirements for methane leakage from their own wells. Then they proposed a second rule to eliminate EPA's regulatory authority over methane emissions from oil and gas facilities. That's getting a little bit out there, because methane is a greenhouse gas, regulable as a pollutant by the EPA, and it also has a whole lot of unfortunate characteristics for people who have to breathe it in, entirely apart from the climate harm and damage it does. But that's what the oil and gas industry wanted EPA to do, to eliminate its regulatory authority over methane emissions. And then, more recently, on August 13th of 2020, they got EPA to promulgate a rule to eliminate that rule, to eliminate that regulatory authority over methane emissions from oil and gas facilities. This is dirty conduct by an industry to take advantage of its ability to plant industry operatives in positions of public responsibility in order to leak more methane, put less equipment in place to protect against methane leakage, and reduce its requirements even to report on the methane leakage that is going on. That is not responsible corporate conduct. These rules are a disgrace. The CRA should pass, and we should get on to taking on this problem of methane. I'll close by pointing out that I have a bill that would do quite a lot to solve this problem. One of the problems in this whole enterprise of pollution is that when it's free to pollute, people will pollute. If corporations view themselves as having only an obligation to their shareholders, and only an obligation to their shareholders that is denominated in dollars, why would they ever spend any money at all to protect against pollution unless they were required to or unless it had a cost? We know it actually has a cost. People suffer from pollution. That's a cost. Our oceans are acidifying because of carbon dioxide pollution. That's a cost. People lose their homes in wildfires that didn't used to happen. That's a cost. My state has to plan to lose its current map to sea level rise and to lose precious shorefront land. That's a cost. These are real costs. The industry just doesn't want to pay them. They want a free ride on everybody else's suffering. And one way to solve that is to put a price on the pollution. And by the way, this is not a liberal, democratic, environmental agenda. This is Economics 101. Milton Friedman, for Pete's sake, said that if you want to have an economic system that works, you've got to put what he called negative externalities, the bad things that happen that hurt other people. You got to put the cost of that into the product. Otherwise, you don't have a market system. You've got a subsidy system. You're picking winners and losers. And as much as my colleagues on the other side like to say that they don't like subsidies and they don't want to see government picking winners and losers, when it's the fossil fuel industry that gets subsidized, when it's the fossil fuel industry that's the winner, they can't line up fast enough to subsidize and pick winners and losers. So we're going to have to work pretty hard to solve this problem because we got some real hazards in front of us. What my bill would do is to measure the thing that they didn't want to do, measure methane emissions from oil and gas production. As I said, new developments in satellite technology mean we don't have to depend on them any longer. We can actually do a lot of this measuring. We can check their measuring. We can, to use Reagan's phrase, trust but verify what they're reporting with a whole lot of other data that we can pull together. So get the data. How much are they leaking? Figure it out basin by basin, because that's where it really happens. It happens in these pools that emerge from the basins from all of the leakage. And then put a price on it. Not hard to do. There's a social cost of carbon that President Obama proposed. President Biden has put it back in at the previous level while they get to work on figuring out what updates there should be to it. We have a social cost of carbon. You can quantify the methane harm and compare it to the carbon harm. You can make an equivalency between those two, and you can determine what the social cost of methane leakage should be. It's really not all that complicated. We would start it in 2023 so that the industry, which has been so reprehensible in its leakage, in its influence over EPA, and its influence in the Trump administration, we're actually giving them a chance to clean up their act and do what they should have done all along. So it would begin in 2023, and it would cost them $1,800 per ton of leaked methane. You leak it, you pay for it. It's not that complicated. When I was growing up, we had a pretty simple rule in my family. You spill it, you clean it up. I don't know why that's suddenly not an appropriate rule when the company and the industry gets big enough and has enough political power and dark money to be pulling strings around here. That ought to be the rule. You spill it, you clean it up. You leak the methane, you pay for it. So I hope that we can get that methane factor passed into law as well. Because we know perfectly well this is not an industry that is going to pursue the public interest if it's not required to. We saw that in the Trump administration. We saw it on March 2nd, 2017. We saw it on March 28th, 2017. We saw it on April 19th, 2017. We saw it on May 10th, 2017. We saw it on September 11th, 2018, on August 28th, 2019, on August 13, 2020, when over and over and over again, they hurt the public by using their clout over the regulatory agencies of this country to their own benefit. So you can't count on them to take care of this on their own. They just won't. They've proven that. That's not a contested fact any longer. We gave them the chance to clean up their act without this kind of requirement, and they totally failed. In fact, they spent all their energy trying to degrade the regulatory authority that kept them trying to clean up methane. So let's solve this problem. Methane is a real problem. There's a lot of it changing our climate. The climate situation has become an emergency. Methane is easily preventable from leaking. And by the way, here's the added bonus. It gives a lot of people jobs. There's a lot of work that we can do to reclaim the damage that the fossil fuel industry has caused. Cleaning up the wells, cleaning up the mines, cleaning up the piping. Those are all real jobs. So let's get after it. Let's start with the CRA. Let's go on to a proper methane fee to put the leaking out of business, and on from there. Mr. President, I yield the floor.